700 tarnished copper tanks hit the mud in front of her barn. The whole valley called it a mountain of junk. She said nothing. Then she put a polishing wheel to the first turn-of-the-century stamp. The man in the suit stopped smiling when he saw the number. The last flatbed backed up to the barn with its hydraulics whining, and the driver didn't even bother to get out. He just tipped the bed and let 40-odd tanks roll off into the mud like he was dumping gravel. They hit hard. Copper doesn't ring when it lands in wet ground. It thuds, low and dull, one after another. A sound like somebody dropping furniture down a staircase for 4 straight minutes. Ella Rankin stood in it. 24 years old, 5'6", her dark chestnut braid hanging heavy down the back of a faded olive-green canvas work jacket, mud up over the ankles of scuffed brown boots laced with 2 different colors of lace. Her cheekbones had gone red in the March air. She didn't step back when the tanks came off. Her right hand stayed in her jacket pocket, closed around the brass handle of her grandfather's copper scraper, the way some people hold a rosary. The driver leaned out his window and hollered over the engine. "Lady, you sure you don't want us to haul this straight to the landfill? Save you the trouble twice." His buddy in the second truck laughed so hard he had to wipe his eyes. She said nothing. She lifted one hand off the scraper and pointed at the flatbed's tailgate, still dripping, and the driver stopped laughing long enough to latch it. 700 tanks. That was the count on the bill of lading, folded in her breast pocket, soft already from being read too many times. 700 copper hot water cylinders pulled out of a shuttered warehouse in 3 counties over. Most of them made between 1901 and 1938, every one of them tarnished to the color of an old penny left in a creek. Green in the seams, dented at the shoulders. 40 tons of metal sitting in a field that hadn't grown anything worth selling in 6 years. Down on the county road, pickups slowed. Not one stopped. They just rolled past at 15 miles an hour with the windows cracked, getting a good long look, then sped up again once they were past the mailbox. By supper time, the whole valley would know what the Rankin girl had done with her inheritance. Here's what she'd done with it. Walt Rankin died in November, sitting up in a chair by the wood stove with his boots still on. Late 70s, tall and stooped, silver-white hair combed sideways, hands clasped behind his back, even when he was standing still, doing nothing at all. He left her 90 acres of Kentucky hillside with clay soil the color of dry mortar, a barn with a sagging north wall, $406 in a coffee can, a 1968 tractor that started on the 3rd try if you were nice to it, and a leather-bound journal with a pencil jammed down the spine and a water stain across the cover shaped like a state nobody could agree on. The place lost money. It had lost money for years. Everybody local knew the number. The last 2 seasons of hay had cleared $1,100 combined, and the property taxes alone ran $840. So in February, Ella drove that tractor 40 miles and traded it. Straight across. The tractor for a warehouse full of scrap copper cylinders a liquidation outfit couldn't move because the scrap price had cratered and the tanks were too bulky to be worth the freight. The man who took the tractor shook her hand and told his secretary, loud enough for Ella to hear it through the door, that some folks are just born to be somebody else's cleanup crew. Then she paid the freight herself. $75 a load, 9 loads, out of the coffee can and out of what she got selling Walt's welder. $675 to haul home the thing everybody else was paying to get rid of. Margaret Coyle came down to the fence line while the last truck was still turning around. Stocky, 5'3", steel gray bob, tortoiseshell reading glasses shoved up on her head, green rubber barn boots, hands planted on her hips in that way she had that meant she was about to say the quiet part. "Ella, honey." Margaret looked at the pile, then at the girl, then back at the pile. "You just bought 40 tons of trash." Ella wiped her palm on the rag hanging off her belt loop. "It's copper." 2 words, flat as a shut door, and Margaret Coyle didn't have a single thing to put after them. Now, you want to know how bad it looked? It looked bad. Standing at the top of that field, you could see the whole shape of it. A hillside going to Broomsedge, a barn that needed $600 of lumber it wasn't going to get, and this dull, green-brown mountain of dead metal spilling out of the mud like something washed up after a flood. No tractor anymore, no welder. $400 turned into $60. A 24-year-old woman standing alone in the middle of it with her hands at her sides. Have you ever put every dollar you had on something the whole world had already thrown away? She worked till dark anyway, dragged 14 tanks up out of the standing water by hand, one at a time, walking them end over end the way you walk a barrel, because water in the seams meant rot in the seams, and she'd already lost enough. Her forearms shook by the 11th. She did 3 more. The kitchen that night was cold enough to see her breath in. She lit the lamp instead of the overhead. The overhead ran the meter, and the meter ran the bill. Took the jacket off, hung it on the chair back, and the brass scraper knocked against the wood with a sound she'd been hearing her whole life. Then she pulled Walt's journal off the shelf. The cover was cool and pebbled, and the pencil was still down the spine where he'd left it in November. She opened it flat on the table under the lamp, and the pages smelled like wood smoke and machine oil in the inside of a barn coat. His handwriting ran uphill on every line, the way it always had, letters crowding each other at the margin. And there, on the second page, pressed so hard into the paper that the words showed through the other side, underlined twice. Waste is just a failure of imagination. Dawn came gray and wet over the ridge, and she closed the journal without a word, set it on the shelf above the stove, and went out to work. The first tank sat where the trucks had dumped it, half sunk in the mud at the top of the pasture. 6 feet long, barrel round, the ends domed like the nose of something built to move. She'd cut 2 poplar logs the night before and dragged them into a cradle, and now she wrestled the thing up onto them inch by inch with a fence bar and her own stubborn weight, boots slipping, breath steaming. 20 minutes to move something a machine would have handled in 10 seconds. She didn't have a machine. She had forearms and time. Up close, the metal was black, not brown. That's the part that mattered, and she didn't know it yet. She started at the shoulder of the tank with a wire brush and got nowhere. The black wasn't loose, it clung like paint. So she pulled out her grandfather's brass-handled copper scraper, the one that lived in the right pocket of that faded olive canvas jacket like it had been welded there, and she laid the edge to it at a shallow angle and pushed. A curl of black came away, and under it, pink. Salmon pink, almost warm, the color of a sunrise on the underside of a cloud. She stopped, ran her thumb across it. 2 inches of clean metal in a field of tar-black corrosion, and she understood something in that second that the entire county had gotten wrong for 11 years. Copper doesn't rust through. Iron does. Iron eats itself, flakes off, exposes fresh iron, and repeats until there's nothing left but red dust and a hole. Copper builds a skin and then quits. That black crust was copper sulfide, sulfur out of the air, out of decades of coal smoke drifting down the valley, bonding to the surface maybe 2 or 3 thousandths of an inch deep, and then stopping cold because the skin itself blocked whatever came next. It wasn't decay, it was armor. 11 years lying in the weeds, and those tanks had lost almost nothing. Everybody had looked at black and thought dead. Black was just dirty. Have you ever stood alone in a wet field at 6 in the morning, holding a piece of proof that nobody else in the world wants to hear? She scraped for 4 hours. Her shoulders learned it before her head did. The angle her grandfather used to hold. 22 degrees or thereabouts, edge leading, wrist locked, push from the hip and not the arm. She'd watched him do it 1,000 times on the workbench when she was too short to see over it. Hold it too steep, and the scraper chatters and gouges. Hold it too flat, and it slides and polishes nothing. There's a narrow band between those where the tool bites clean and lifts the crust in ribbons. And her hands found it on their own, out of some memory that lived below thinking. Walt Rankin had been dead 9 weeks. His hand was still in hers. By dark, she had a patch of bare copper the size of a door, and her palms were raw, and she'd done maybe 1/40th of one tank. That math is what made her stupid the next morning. 406 tanks. At 4 hours a square yard, she'd be scraping until she was 60. So she drove into town and bought a gallon of muriatic acid at the hardware store, the strong stuff for concrete, and mixed it half and half in a galvanized tub and sank a loose end panel in it and waited. It went beautiful for 90 seconds. The black lifted off in sheets. Then it kept going. When she pulled the panel out with a pair of tongs, the surface had gone dull and grainy and orange, and when she ran her thumb across it, the metal came off on her skin like chalk. She'd strip the sulfide, and then she'd strip the copper right under it, unevenly, faster along the grain lines, and the whole panel was pitted with shallow craters you could see from 10 feet away. Ruined. Not a little ruined. Worthless. You can't polish out a pit. There's nothing to polish. The metal that made the surface is gone into the tub. She stood there with the tongs and looked at what she'd done and said nothing at all. Then she poured the acid into a bucket, capped it, and set it in the shed where she wouldn't reach for it again. The lesson took about a day to settle. Speed was the enemy. Anything strong enough to strip that crust in 90 seconds was strong enough to strip the good metal in 120, and she had no way to stand there and stop it at exactly the right instant across 400 tanks. So she went the other direction entirely. Salt and white vinegar, mixed into a paste with a little flour to hold it on a curved surface. Acetic acid, weak as a kitchen, cheap as dirt. It wouldn't eat the copper if she left it on for an hour, and it dissolved the sulfide slowly enough that the metal underneath never noticed. Paste it on. Let it sit 20 minutes. Wipe. Then the mechanical part, a felt wheel on a corded drill, rouge compound, in slow, steady passes with almost no pressure, because pressure heats the surface and heat blues it. She burned through 3 wheels learning that. 10 days in, the system worked. It was slow and boring, and her arms ached every night, and she went through vinegar by the case, but it worked, and the copper came up under the wheel like something rising out of water. On the 11th day, working the flat shoulder of tank number 9, the wheel lifted and there was a mark. She wiped the compound haze away with the rag off her belt loop. Raised letters, struck into the metal by a die under pressure, worn but perfectly readable. A maker's name in an arc, and beneath it a 4-digit number. 1911. She sat back on her heels in the sawdust and the copper dust, hazel green eyes fixed on it, the loose strands at her temples stuck to her forehead, and she didn't move for a long minute. Then she got up and went walking the rows with the rag in her hand, wiping shoulders. By dark, she'd found 12 more. 2 days later, the county library in Elkin got its strangest patron of the year. A woman in a faded olive-green canvas work jacket, dark chestnut braid down her back, hauling a stack of trade catalogs to the corner table and spreading a paper napkin flat beside them. On the napkin, in pencil, she'd copied the stamp off that curved sheet of metal. A crown, 2 letters, the number 1911. Nobody at the front desk knew what to make of her. She didn't ask for help, she just read. What Ella Rankin found over the next 6 hours changed the shape of the whole thing. Turn-of-the-century distillation works, the big copper column stills, the doublers, the condensing worms, weren't built the way modern tanks are built. They weren't welded. Welding barely existed in any usable form for copper sheet before the 20s. Those old vessels were hammered, sheet by sheet over a wooden form, by men who worked the metal cold and annealed it hot and got a curve you cannot machine. Then the seams were lapped and riveted, and the rivet line was sealed with a bead of soft solder run in by hand. Which meant the seams on that pile behind her grandfather's barn, those rows of little raised dots she'd been running her thumb over for a week without knowing what they were rivets. Hand-set rivets. Every single one placed by a human being who died before her grandfather was born. Modern reclamation doesn't care. Modern reclamation weighs it. She came home with photocopies and a number in her head, and then she did the thing nobody in that valley would have spent the money on. She took a copper shaving, one curl off the edge of a sound sheet, maybe the weight of a nickel, sealed it in an envelope, and mailed it to an assay lab in Knoxville with a check for $40. $40. That was 2 weeks of groceries. She wrote it in the ledger the same way her grandfather wrote everything, date and figure and 3 words. Assay. 1 shaving. The result came back 9 days later on a single sheet of paper. 99.2%. She read it standing at the mailbox with the wind coming red into her cheekbones. And then she walked down to Margaret Coyle's place, because Margaret was the only person in 4 miles who'd ask what it meant instead of laughing first. Margaret stood in her yard, hands on her hips, feet planted wide, tortoiseshell readers pushed up into her steel gray bob. 99.2 of what, honey? Ella didn't give her a lecture. She never did. She just picked up a scrap of the modern stuff off her truck bed, a length of plumbing tube, and bent it in her hands. It creased. It kinked, and it stayed kinked, an ugly little fold. Then she took a strip off one of the old sheets and bent that, slow, thumb walking along the curve, and it moved like something alive and came back smooth. She held both up. That one's got other metal in it, she said. This one's just copper. That's what 99.2 means. Almost nothing else in it. No zinc, no lead, no cheap filler alloy that stiffens the sheet and kills the way it takes a hammer. It means the metal will move under the tool instead of fighting it. It means it can be annealed and worked and annealed again a dozen times without cracking. It means the men who hammered it in 1911 knew exactly what they were buying and paid for it. Margaret looked at the 2 strips a long moment and said nothing, which from Margaret was a standing ovation. The sorting took Ella 11 days. She dragged every piece out of the pile with a hay hook and a plank ramp, one at a time. 700 and some odd pieces of scrap that the world had already written off twice. Chalk in her left hand. Grandfather's brass-handled copper scraper in her right jacket pocket, where it always was, warm from her body by noon. She graded them on the barn's center post in 3 chalked columns. Stamped 118. Pieces carrying a maker's mark, a date, a foundry crown. Provenance. History you could photograph. Sound 402. No stamp, but unpitted, unsplit, rivets intact, sheet thick enough to work. Crushed 180. Folded, torn, holed, only good for cutting down into small stock. 700 pieces, exactly. She wrote the tally in the journal under her grandfather's last entry and underlined it once. Word got around the way it does. By December, the feed store in town had a name for her place, and men said it out loud at the counter with their coffee going cold. The Copper Junkyard. That was the polite version. Somebody started calling her the Scrap Widow, which made no sense at all, since she'd never been married and nobody had died but Walt. But cruelty doesn't need to make sense. It just needs an audience. She heard it. Standing right there at the register with a 50-pound bag of layer feed on her shoulder, hazel green eyes level, the pale thumbprint birthmark below her ear showing above her collar. She paid. She said thank you to the clerk. She walked out. That's the whole scene. That's how she answered every single time. Have you ever had a room laugh at you and known, actually known in your hands, in the callous of them, that you were right? It's a lonely kind of certain. There's no comfort in it. You can't spend it. You just carry it out to the truck with the feed bag and drive home and go back to work. And the only thing that keeps you upright is a dead man's handwriting in a water-stained journal and the fact that the metal does what he said it would do. But here's the thing about a hoard. 700 pieces of 99.2% copper sitting on 11 acres in a valley where everybody talks. That doesn't stay quiet. Feed store talk travels. Somebody's brother-in-law hauls for a reclamation outfit out of Bristol. Somebody mentions the crazy Rankin girl in her pile. And on a Tuesday morning in the second week of January, with frost still white in the tire ruts, and Ella up on a sawhorse flattening a stamped sheet, a gray sedan slowed at the county road, checked the mailbox, and turned into her lane. The car door opened like a bank vault, slow, quiet, expensive sounding. Out came Dean Halstead in his charcoal gray suit jacket and pale blue dress shirt, no tie, pressed slacks, polished black Oxfords stepping down into 3 inches of Kentucky mud like the mud ought to apologize. Rimless glasses with silver arms, sandy blonde hair combed back neat, slim aluminum clipboard held flat against his chest like a shield he'd never had to use. And that smile. God, that smile. Patient. The kind of smile a man wears when he already knows how the conversation ends. Ella was at the north row of tanks, sleeves shoved up her forearms, the rag hanging off her belt loop, her single, thick chestnut braid down the back of that faded olive-green canvas jacket. She didn't come to him. He walked to her. That was the first thing he lost that day, and he didn't even notice. Miss Rankin, one hand in his pocket, chin lifted. Dean Halstead, Operations, Fayette Metal Reclamation. I understand you took delivery of about 140 units. 152, she said. He wrote it down. Of course he wrote it down. Here's the pitch, and I want you to hear how smooth it is, because smooth is the whole weapon. Copper scrap, he said, was running 61 cents a pound that month. Those old stamped water heater tanks averaged, call it 110 pounds of recoverable copper and copper alloy each once you strip the steel jacket. Do the multiplication. He'd already done it. Roughly $10,200 cash that afternoon, drawn on a company check she could cash at the Winchester branch by 4 o'clock. Hauling included. Flatbeds Tuesday. He'd even grade the lane for her on the way out. 10 grand. To a 24-year-old sitting on a dead man's farm with 1,800 in the coffee can and a winter coming. That's a fair number, he said. That's actually a generous number, given what these are. Then he explained what they were. Kindly. That's the part that curdles. He tapped a tank with one knuckle and it rang dull. You've got maybe 4 square feet of usable sheet in each of these, and it's work-hardened, and it's pitted. Nobody restores these. There's no market. There's no aftermarket. Nobody's building a house in 1979 that wants a hand-hammered copper cylinder from 1931. He said the year like it was a disease. I've been doing this 19 years. I've seen 3 people try to make something out of stock like this. All 3 of them called me eventually. All 3 of them called me after they'd burned a year they couldn't afford. Then he looked at her boots. Scuffed brown leather, mismatched laces. He looked at the barn with its sagging north eave. He looked at the whole inheritance, and he smiled wider. I'll be straight with you because I think you deserve straight. You're a girl on a broke farm with a pile of somebody else's junk. Your grandfather was a sweet old man, and he was also the reason this place has a mortgage on it. Sentiment doesn't weigh anything on my scale. Copper does. He said sweet old man the way you'd pat a dog on the head before putting it down. Ella's cheekbones went red in the cold air. Not from shame, from something else entirely. She held out her hand for the offer sheet. He gave it to her, pleased, thinking she wanted to read the terms. She turned it over to the blank side, took the pencil out of her jacket, and started doing arithmetic against the flat of a tank. Out loud, slow, so he'd have to stand there and listen to every number. You're paying 61 cents a pound. That's $10,200 for all 152. Pencil scratch. $67 a tank. Correct. There's a shop in Louisville selling reproduction hammered copper hoods. $1,100. Machine press sheet, no stamp, no maker's mark. Scratch. These have a mark. Bell Foundry, Ashland, stamped in the shoulder, dated. 86 of them still have a legible date. He shifted his weight. First time. Say I lose half to scrap and mistakes. Say I only ever finish 40. 40 times 1,100 is 44,000. She circled it. Against 10-2. And I still have 112 tanks in the mud. You're assuming somebody buys them. I'm assuming one tank, restored, is worth more than a ton of your scrap, she said. That part's just numbers. Yours. She handed the sheet back. He didn't take it. And this is where you learn what men like Dean Halstead actually are. He's not a monster. He's a system with a haircut. He does not hate her. He barely sees her. He has a quota, a route, a scale, and a smile he's used 4,000 times, and every one of those times it worked, because the world is built to make people take the check. He tucked the clipboard back against his chest. Metal's a commodity, Miss Rankin. Craft is a hobby. Hobbies don't pay a mortgage. Neither does an empty field. He laughed. A small one, genuine, almost warm. That was the worst sound of the whole afternoon. Then he pulled a business card from his inside pocket, thick stock, embossed edges, and set it on the rim of the nearest tank where it sat white and clean against green corrosion. For when the winter comes, he said, not if, when. Prices drop in February. I'll still take them at 52. It won't be as good a day for you, but I'll still take them. He walked back to the gray sedan, and here's the detail Ella never forgot. He wiped each Oxford on the running board before he got in. Twice. Like the farm was something he'd caught. The engine turned over. Gravel popped. The sedan backed down the lane, and the exhaust hung in the cold air a long while after it was gone. And then there was nothing at all except the sound of the creek and 152 rusted stamped tanks sitting in the mud exactly where they'd sat that morning, worth $10,200 to a man with a clipboard and absolutely nothing to anyone else on earth. Ella stood there a while, square-shouldered, weight settled even, hands at her sides. Then she picked up his card, walked into the barn, and laid the offer sheet flat on the workbench beside her grandfather's brass-handled copper scraper. She looked at the arithmetic on the back. First frost came in on a Tuesday, silvering the barn roof and turning the gravel white. And Ella Rankin was already out there at dawn, with her breath hanging in front of her face, dragging planks across the dirt floor. The cheeks above those high, flat cheekbones had gone red the way they always did in cold air. Her braid was tucked down inside the collar of the olive-green canvas jacket. She was building a bench. 2-inch pine planks laid across 4 cradles she'd cut from oak barrel staves salvaged off the back of the property, curved side down so the whole thing sat like a boat hull on the packed clay. Solid, no wobble. She tested it by putting her whole 130 pounds on one end and standing there, still, hands at her sides, listening for a creak that never came. Here's the thing about that bench. It wasn't for building tanks. because the idea had come to her sometime in the last week of October, standing in the tank yard with frost on her boots. And it went like this. Nobody on God's green earth wants a 100-year-old milk tank, but everybody wants copper. Not copper as a commodity, copper as a surface. A range hood over a stove, a farmhouse sink with a hammered basin, ceiling panels, a bar top for some restaurant in Lexington that wants to look like it's been there since Prohibition. The metal was worthless as a container and priceless as a skin, and the difference between those two things was nothing but imagination and about 400 hours of work she hadn't done yet. She cut the first tank open with a hacksaw because that's what she had. Took her most of a day. And when the seam finally gave and she peeled the wall back and got a caliper on it, she stood there for a long minute doing arithmetic in her head. 14 gauge, 64 thousandths of an inch. Modern decorative copper runs 32 gauge, maybe 24 if somebody's feeling generous. This was twice the thickness of anything a supplier would sell you in 1988, laid down in 1911 by men who assumed the thing would outlive them and were correct. You could hammer that. You could work a texture into it that would hold light instead of just reflecting it. You could drop a wrench on it from 6 feet and it'd shrug. Dean Halstead had offered her 75 cents a pound for this. Let that sit. 75 cents a pound, the aluminum clipboard held flat against his chest, that patient, unhurried smile, the rimless glasses catching the light while he explained to her, slowly, the way you'd explain a bus schedule to somebody who'd never left the county, that there's no market for sentiment, sweetheart. There's a market for tonnage. You've got a barn full of junk and a name that doesn't mean anything anymore. He said it kindly. That's the part that ought to make your jaw tighten. He said it the way a man says something he considers obviously true and mildly sad. And then he got in his car and drove back to whatever office had polished floors. The small noise. One girl told she was nothing on a gravel drive in October. The catastrophic failure. A company that had been buying up a century of American metalwork at scrap price for 11 years and melting it into ingots. Because nobody in the building had ever once asked what the metal was before they asked what it weighed. She didn't argue with him. She never did. She just went and got a hammer. Failure came fast, and it came at a solder seam. She cut 2 panels, butted them, ran a bead of lead-free solder along the joint with the propane torch, and it looked beautiful. Bright, tight, clean. Then she took the join panel to the form to put a gentle bend in it for the hood's front face, leaned into it with the heel of her hand, and the seams split with a sound like a knuckle cracking. Not the solder, the copper beside the solder. It tore in a jagged line 4 inches long, and the whole panel was firewood. She stood in the cold barn holding the ruined thing and didn't say a word for about a minute and a half. Then she went inside and opened the journal. Walt Rankin's handwriting was small and slanted, and he never wasted a line. Page 90-something, under a sketch of a firebox. Copper work hardens. Every hammer blow tightens the grain. Beat it too long, and it turns brittle as a soda cracker. Heat to a dull cherry, not orange, dull cherry, in a dark room where you can see it, and quench. Softens right back down. Metal's like a person that way. Won't bend forever without a rest. Annealing. She'd never heard the word out loud in her life, so she waited till full dark, killed the barn lights, and ran the torch across a test strip until the copper came up a deep, sullen red that looked like the last coal in a stove. Roughly 1100 degrees, though she had no gauge for it. She had her grandfather's eyes in a dark room. Then straight into a bucket of water. Hiss, steam, and when she pulled it out, the strip bent under her thumb like heavy cloth. She annealed every panel after that. Hammered a stretch, went brittle, heated to dull cherry, quenched, kept going. The whole hood took 11 annealing cycles and something close to 9,000 hammer blows with a ball peen she'd reground herself, working the texture in overlapping arcs so the light would break across it instead of lying flat. And she planned the whole pattern around 1 square inch she refused to touch. Because stamped into the original tank wall, faint under a century of tarnish, was a maker's mark and a date. 1911. She laid the hammered field out so that stamp sat dead center on the front face, untouched, smooth, a little island of history in a sea of texture. The second seam held. She hung the hood from the barn rafter on 2 lengths of chain, and it turned slow in the cold, and the lamp caught in 10,000 dimples and threw them back across the walls like water light. She stood under it a long while, hands at her sides. "Waste is just a failure of imagination," she said, out loud, to nobody at all. Beautiful things don't pay. February. Rain came down on the barn roof for 11 days straight, the kind that doesn't hammer, just leans. Ella Rankin sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open under a bulb and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding since Christmas. $412 in the account. Property tax due in March at $680. Propane at 90 a fill and the tank reading a quarter. The hood hung out in the barn, catching what light there was, and not one human being on this earth had offered her a dime for it. 2 years. That's how long she'd been at it. 2 years of hauling ruined copper tanks out of a scrapyard row. 2 years of stripping solder, annealing sheet over a rosebud torch. 2 years of the county driving past slow to look at the crazy Rankin girl and her pile of green junk. She had 704 tanks stacked in the north field under tarps. She had 11 finished panels, 1 hood, and a notebook full of hammer patterns. She had no customers. The bank had an offer. Of course it did. $9,000 against the deed at 14.25%. And the loan officer had said the words gently, the way you'd talk to somebody standing on a ledge. And there was the other offer, the cleaner one, sitting in an envelope on the corner of the table where it had been sitting since the 2nd week of January. Dean Halstead's letterhead, the metal reclamation firm. He'd come out himself in November in that charcoal suit jacket with no tie, polished black Oxfords picking their way around the mud like the mud was beneath him too. Aluminum clipboard flat against his chest, rimless glasses beaded with drizzle. He'd looked at the tanks. He'd looked at the barn. He'd smiled that patient, unhurried smile and said the number out loud. 700 units, mixed copper. Call it 74,000 pounds. I can do 70 cents, 52,000, give or take, and I'll haul it myself. Then he tipped his chin at the barn door and added the part she still heard at 3 in the morning. "Miss Rankin, I've been doing this 22 years. Your grandfather sat on those tanks until the day he died, and all he had to show for it was a pile of scrap and a farm he couldn't heat. You're not an artisan. You're a girl with a hammer and an inheritance she doesn't know how to spend. Take the check. Go be somebody somewhere else." $52,000 is a real number when you have 412. She had a pen in her hand that night. That's the part nobody tells you about, how close it comes. The rain going on and on above her, the fire down to coals, the envelope open and the signature line blank and clean. 52,000 pays the tax, kills the debt, buys a truck that starts every time. She could be in a warm apartment in Lexington by April with money in a savings account and nobody laughing at her in the feed store. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea nobody else believed in? Not a weekend, not a hobby, everything, the house, the years, your name in a small town where a name is all you get. and then sat alone in the middle of the night with the easy way out lying flat on the table in front of you, already signed by the other man, waiting for one stroke of ink? She set the pen down, not out of courage, out of habit, the same habit that made her check the stove damper before bed. She got up, went to the shelf, and took down the leather-bound journal, water-stained along the bottom edge, pencil still shoved in the spine where he'd left it. She'd read it 100 times. She opened it that night the way you open a door in a house you already know, and her thumb caught 2 pages stuck together near the back, gummed by an old spill. She'd never separated them. In 2 years, she had never once turned that page. Underneath, a drawing. Pencil, careful, ruled with a straight edge. A range hood, trapezoid body, rolled lip, a riveted seam running the front face. Beside it, in that cramped block lettering, the notes. Anneal at dull red, Planish cold. Seam with copper rivets, no solder. Solder is a lie that fails in 10 years. And in the corner, the date, March 1979. He'd sketched the thing 11 years before he died. He bought the first 40 tanks that same spring. Everybody in the county thought Walt Rankin had gone senile, hoarding rotted water heaters, and the truth was he'd had a design in his hand and no strength left in his shoulders to raise the hammer. Ella sat there with the rain coming down and the arithmetic finally rearranged itself in her skull. She hadn't been keeping his junk. She hadn't been honoring a dead man by being stubborn on his behalf. He'd left her the unfinished half of a job. The tanks weren't a mess he failed to clean up. They were material, bought on purpose, stockpiled for work he already knew how to do and would never live to do. Waste is just a failure of imagination. He'd written it on the inside cover in 1971, and she'd read it as a saying. It wasn't a saying. It was an instruction, and he'd been counting on somebody with young shoulders to follow it. She looked at the envelope. $52,000 for 700 pieces of a plan. She fed it to the coals. It went up bright, then black, then nothing. The doubt didn't leave because she felt inspired. It left because she went out to the barn at 2 in the morning in the olive green canvas jacket, the rags swinging off her belt loop, boots with the mismatched laces splashing across the yard. And she pulled the light chain and saw the proof hanging there. 11 panels racked along the wall, the hood on its rafter chain. Copper she'd raised out of garbage with her own 2 hands, planished until the surface broke light into 1,000 small suns. She reached into her right pocket and closed her fingers around the brass-handled scraper, worn smooth by a man's grip before hers. Then she laid her open palm flat on the panel she'd finished at dusk. It was still warm from the day's work. 3 days later, a green station wagon with Oregon plates and a busted muffler came up the lane at 15 miles an hour, stopping twice, the driver hanging his head out the window like a man reading street signs in a country with no streets. His name was Isaac Fenimore, and he designed restaurant kitchens in Portland. He'd taken a wrong turn off the county road 40 minutes back, and he was late to a walkthrough in Eugene, and his map had gone to pulp on the passenger seat under a spilled thermos of coffee. He wanted directions, that's all. He was going to get directions and leave. Ella came out of the barn with the rag hanging off her belt loop and her braid over her shoulder, thumbing the brass-handled scraper in her jacket pocket, the way she always did when a stranger showed up in the lane. Cold morning. Her cheekbones had gone pink. She pointed him back down toward the fork and told him to bear left at the burned silo, and he thanked her, and then he looked past her. The barn doors were open. Sun was coming in low across the east wall, and 40 feet of hammered copper was sitting in there, catching it. Have you ever watched a man forget entirely what he came for? Isaac got out of the car. He didn't ask. He just walked, and Ella let him. Because she'd been working alone long enough to know the difference between a man who wanted something from her and a man who'd been ambushed by something beautiful. 9 hood canopies, 2 flue collars, a stack of annealed sheet, soft as cloth, waiting. The one she'd finished at 2 in the morning still had the heat memory in it, and the seams ran clean and true down the corners where she'd learned, the hard way, over 2 years, over 4 ruined panels, to leave a 1/16 of an inch of travel so the metal could move when it got hot and not tear itself open along the joint. Isaac put his hand near the surface without touching it. "Where is this from?" She turned the front lip over so he could see the stamp. The one Walt had circled in the journal twice. 1911, and a maker's mark half worn off, from the old Cascade dairy plant that got scrapped for pennies. He went back to the car for his camera. He shot 31 frames of that stamp, and the hammer field around it, kneeling in the dirt in a good coat. And when he stood up, he had a look on his face like a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to say out loud. "What else do you have?" She showed him. The stack. The dented sheet still to be worked. The scrap pile that people in that valley had called a junk heap for 6 years running. That Dean Halstead had once stood beside with his aluminum clipboard against his chest and his patient little smile and said, to her face, in front of 2 men from the county, "Sweetheart, this is scrap. It doesn't get to be anything else because you want it to. You're 24 and you're sitting on a pile of trash with your grandfather's ghost telling you it's a fortune. Sign the release, take the $400, and stop embarrassing the family name." $400 for 11,000 pounds of pre-war hammered copper. Isaac asked what she'd charge for 1 hood. She named a number. He said it fast. Too fast, actually, which told her the number was low, and she filed that away and didn't change it because she'd said it, and she wasn't going to be a person who moved her price mid-breath. Then she gave him her terms, and she gave them the way she gave everything, short, flat, and final. Half up front, no rush jobs. The annealing takes what it takes, and if I hurry it, the seam splits at 800 degrees, and you get a hood that leaks smoke into a dining room. And the 1911 stamp stays visible on every unit. You don't polish it out. You don't cover it with a trim strip. He blinked. The stamp's a defect to most guys. Not to me. Those are my terms. Sparse men understand closed doors. Isaac Fenimore heard one and nodded. The build-out took 9 weeks. She couldn't do 11 hoods alone. Not the annealing, which needs 1 person on the torch reading the color of the metal and a second person ready with the tongs the second it goes from red to that dull orange-gray that means the crystal structure is let go and the copper will bend instead of crack. Miss it by 20 seconds and you've work-hardened it right back and you're starting over. Margaret Coyle came up the drive with her dented tin thermos, glasses pushed up in her steel-gray hair, feet planted wide in her green barn boots, and said her sister's boy Ronnie was 26 and out of work since the mill line cut back, and could Ella use hands? Ella could use hands. Ronnie Coyle learned the torch in 4 days, and the color in 11. He burned a hole through 1 sheet, $32 of copper, gone, and stood there waiting to be yelled at. Ella looked at the hole and said the thing Walt had written in the water-stained journal in pencil, the thing she'd been saying to herself since she was 22 and broke and alone with a barn full of garbage. Waste is just a failure of imagination. Then she cut the ruined sheet into flue collars, and they lost nothing but an afternoon. The truck came on a Tuesday in March. Flatbed, moving blankets, 11 crated canopies riding under tie-downs, each one with a small, dark stamp on the front lip reading 1911, deliberately unpolished, because that's what she'd said, and she'd meant it. Half the valley found reasons to be near the county road that morning. Men who had laughed. Men who'd told her father's people she'd lose the place by Christmas, twice, 2 different Christmases. They stood by their tailgates and watched $40,000 of hammered copper leave a farm they'd called a junkyard. Nobody said a word. Not one. That night, the kitchen table held two things: a signed order for 11 hoods and a check for a $9,800 deposit made out to Rankin Copper in handwriting she'd watched a lost man produce with a busted muffler and a ruined map. She sat down and looked at it a long time before she touched it. 6 weeks after that check cleared, the magazine landed in her mailbox with a plain brown wrapper and her name spelled wrong. Page 41. A full spread, 2 photographs, and a headline in clean serif type. Hand-hammered 1911 copper, restored in Oregon. The top photo was a hood over a range in a house on the Columbia, all warm, reflected light, and that faint, irregular dimpling where a man with a hammer had worked the sheet by hand before anybody's grandfather was born. The bottom photo was her barn. Not her. She'd stayed out of the frame, the way she stayed out of most frames. Just the workbench, the coil of annealed wire, and the brass-handled scraper lying on the wood where she'd set it down. Ella Rankin read the article twice, folded the magazine, and went back to work. Here's what that page did. Within 4 months, the salvage brokers in Portland and Spokane and San Francisco stopped calling stamped 1911 tank sheet old junk copper and started calling it inventory. The 118 tank sheets stamped and stacked in the North Bay, the ones the neighbors had watched her haul home one flatbed load at a time, were suddenly the most sought-after architectural copper on the West Coast. Not because of the metal, anybody can buy copper, because of what the metal had been through. 60-plus years of water and heat and expansion had work-hardened the grain into something a modern rolling mill physically cannot replicate. And every hammer scar on those sheets was a fingerprint nobody could counterfeit. Scarcity plus provenance. That's the whole trick. Tanks that had been going to the reclamation yard at 12 cents a pound started trading between dealers at $180 a piece. Not from her, she wasn't selling raw stock. From her, a finished hood, cut and seamed and annealed and hand-planished, with the stamped serial from the original tank shoulder left visible in the lower corner like a signature, went out the door at $7,200. Do the arithmetic she did, one night, in pencil on the back of a feed receipt. Total invested in the whole gamble over 3 years, the trucking, the acid, the propane, the wire, the borrowed press time, the ruined first 11 attempts, came to a shade under $4,100. The 11 hood order alone was $79,200, roughly 40 times her money. And here's the part that should make your teeth itch, the small noise that turned out to be a catastrophic pattern. When she started tracing serials, because buyers wanted paperwork, and she gave them paperwork, she found the numbers on those shoulders ran in a continuous series from a single works in Ohio. The tanks had been made in batches of about 400 a year, hand-hammered, from 1907 to 1919. And the reclamation industry, quietly, efficiently, for 4 decades, had been feeding them into melt furnaces by the thousand. Nobody logged them. Nobody photographed them. They were weighed, crushed, and poured into ingot, and the hammer marks went back into the pot as undifferentiated metal. An entire American craft output gone into scrap value because scrap value was the only value anyone bothered to measure. Nobody was evil about it. That's the thing. It was just a system that could only see pounds. Which brings us to the man in the polished black Oxfords. Dean Halstead came up her drive in October, the charcoal gray suit jacket over the pale blue shirt, no tie, the slim aluminum clipboard held against his chest like a shield he'd never had to use. Rimless glasses, sandy blonde hair combed back neat, that unhurried, patient smile he'd been wearing the day he told her, 3 years earlier, that a girl who couldn't read a bill of lading had no business signing one, and that the yard didn't have time to babysit hobbyists. He'd also said, standing right about where he was standing now, "Sweetheart, this is a commodity business. You're a rounding error. Take the check, Go buy yourself a nice life and stop wasting men's time." He'd smiled through the whole sentence. Now he wanted the crushed ones back. "The 180 flattened units," he said, checking his clipboard as though the number might have moved. "They're still on your parcel. Our records show them as disposed inventory, but call it a paperwork interest. We'd repurchase at fair market, say 200 a unit. That's $36,000 for scrap you can't use." She had her hands at her sides. Square shoulders, weight settled even, the dark chestnut braid down her back, and a few loose strands at the temples going pale in the light. The rag hung off her belt loop. Cold air had put color high on her cheekbones. "They're not for sale." "Miss Rankin, those are crushed, bale-pressed, the grain's ruined." "The grain's folded," she said, "not ruined. Folded copper takes a patina you can't get any other way. I'm cutting them for tile." Then she told him the rest, plainly, because she had no reason to hide it. 12-inch squares, mounted on ply, $140 a square foot to an architect in Marin who'd already put down a deposit on 800 feet. Halstead did the math behind the rimless glasses. You could watch it land. $36,000 of worthless was $112,000 of finished product, and the only person on the continent who knew how to make the conversion was standing in front of him in a faded olive-green canvas jacket and scuffed boots with mismatched laces. He had nothing to offer her. Not a price, not a favor, not a threat. His entire leverage had been that she was small. 2 weeks later, Harlan Pruitt from the place with the fallen silo knocked on her doorframe with his hat literally in his hand. 60 years old. Had called her project a manure pile in front of 9 men at the co-op. "Got a barn full of old metal," he said. "Roof flashing, some tank sheet, my daddy's milk cooler. Was fixing to haul it off. Wondered if you'd look at it." She looked at it. Told him what was worth keeping and what wasn't, and didn't charge him. The feed store changed after that. Not with apologies. Nobody in that county has ever apologized out loud. The laughing just stopped. And then the questions started coming. Real ones. How do you tell hand-hammered from machine-drawn? What's the acid do? Does the 28 years later, that same barn still smells like hot metal and beeswax? The doors are wider now, hung on rollers instead of hinges, and the floors poured concrete with a drain cut down the middle. But the light comes in the same way it always did, in a long slab through the east windows, catching the dust over the benches. Ella Rankin is 52 years old. The braid down her back has gone silver gray, thick as ever, loose strands at the temples the way they've always been. Same olive canvas jacket, patched twice at the elbow. Same rag through the belt loop. And in the right pocket, worn down to a warm shine, her grandfather's brass-handled copper scraper. She has never once used a different one. 9 people work in that barn. 2 of them do nothing but sort incoming stock. There's a woman on the seam bench who came out of a shuttered radiator plant in Ohio and can read a cold shut in a lap joint faster than Ella can. There's a man on the annealing furnace who checks his flame color against a strip of muslin held at the firebox mouth because that's how he was taught, because that's how she was taught, because that's how a stooped old man in brown duck coveralls did it in 1949 with no thermometer and no money for one. The salvage network runs across 4 states now: Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, Southern Ohio. Copper nobody else will touch. Old brewery kettles, dairy pasteurizer shells, condensate lines out of paper mills, tank walls with 60 years of scale locked in the seams. The scrap men used to laugh at what she'd pay for. Now they call her first because everyone else quotes by the pound and she quotes by what's stamped on it. Margaret Coyle's dented tin thermos sits on the shelf above the sink. It hasn't held coffee in 11 years. Nobody moves it. Margaret came out to that barn in her navy quilted vest and her green rubber barn boots for the better part of 2 decades. Hands on her hips, feet planted wide, tortoiseshell readers pushed up into that steel gray bob, telling anybody who'd listen that they'd all been idiots about the girl. She never once said sorry. She just kept showing up. That's how it's done around here. And somewhere in those years, without a meeting, without a vote, the county quietly stopped scrapping stamped metal. The road crews started setting it aside. The water district called before they cut anything old. Nobody announced a policy change. They just stopped doing the stupid thing. As for Dean Halstead, his firm folded. Not dramatically. There was no scandal, no hearing. Nobody frog-marched out of a building. The reclamation contracts dried up because the materials stopped flowing to them, and the materials stopped flowing because everyone with a truck had figured out they could get 4 times the price from the woman in the valley. Halstead spent a while trying to broker between the two, and when that didn't take, he moved into commercial roofing supply in another county. Last anybody heard, he retired. Remember what he said to her that first summer? 24 years old, standing in a field of 700 rusted tanks, and he adjusted those rimless glasses, held that slim aluminum clipboard against his chest, gave her that patient, unhurried smile, and told her, "Sweetheart, you're a girl with a dead man's junk and a 7th grade understanding of metallurgy. Sign the disposal waiver, take the $75 a unit, and stop embarrassing yourself in front of adults." He built a whole career on the assumption that nobody beneath him could learn anything. She never argued with him. Not once in 28 years. She just kept the receipts and kept the barn open and kept getting better, and the market did the rest. That's the thing about a man who's only ever been a system. You don't have to beat him. You just have to make him unnecessary. In the northeast corner of the barn, past the last bench, there's one tank left from the original 700, unrestored. Scaled, dented, one panel caved where a loader hit it in 1974. Ella has been offered money for it. She won't sell it, and she won't clean it. It stands there as a measuring stick. This is where the material starts, and everything else on this floor is where it can end up. The polishing wheel runs at the far end, and the man on it today is 22. His name is Cole Bracken, and he came to her out of hazard with no trade and a stubborn streak that reminded her of somebody. He's been on the wheel 8 months. He's ruined 4 pieces, learning that you back off the pressure when the metal starts to talk to you. That copper gets soft and grabby right before it burns. That the wheel doesn't remove the tarnish so much as it removes the metal that's holding it. He's working a shoulder panel today, off a Louisville distillery cooker. He rocks it, eases, rocks it again. And out of the haze, in the middle of the panel, something comes up bright. A stamp. Struck in a die that hasn't existed since the Coolidge administration. He stops the wheel. He carries the panel over to the light. Ella comes and stands beside him, square-shouldered, weight settled even, hands at her sides, that faint thumbprint birthmark below her left ear catching the window. 1911, Cole says. 1911, she agrees. $6.90 a foot for the copper, $11,000 for the panel. He looks at her. Because somebody didn't throw it away, she says. She goes to the bench and takes down the journal. Leather-bound, water-stained, spine cracked, pencil still wedged in it. Pages fat with 50 years of another man's handwriting. Flame colors, seam angles, 100 small failures written out plain. She's added her own in the back half. Her handwriting's neater. The failures are the same shape. She puts it in Cole Bracken's hands. He was a stubborn old man in a red flannel shirt who never made real money in his life, she says. And every single thing in this building came out of one line he wrote down. Waste is just a failure of imagination. Cole holds the journal like it's warm. Outside, the valley goes gold at the edges, and the barn light burns on past dark, the way it has for 28 years. Somebody's throwing something away tonight. Go look at it.